Hi everyone, it's Anne. Welcome back to Art on the Creek and welcome to your 9th lesson in our first series of 15 beginner watercolor lessons. You know what? Who doesn't like ice cream? I love it. Let's paint an ice cream cone, shall we? Here we go. I have a surprise for you today. I've decided to use an Albrecht watercolor pencil to draw this in. Now you can do this too. It's totally optional. You don't have to invest in these, but I thought maybe it would show up on camera just a little bit better. I'm using a magenta watercolor pencil, and the colors will all blend and meld in with what we're painting, so it'll turn out just right. There's our reference photo. It's from Pixabay, and I will put a link to it in the description, as always. My other surprise for you today is that I'm going to try and keep this video in real time. It literally took 25 minutes to do. So if you just got a couple minutes to paint and you want to do something to hang in your kitchen or your child's room or even your studio, this is really a fun one to do. We're going to start by going in with that 3/4 inch stroke brush that we have from our Princeton Snap collection, and we're just going to get that cone wet. So you can see all of that magenta is just dissolving. The lines will still be faint. You'll still be able to see them, so you'll know where to put your little waffle marks when we get there. But right now, we're just going to go in with a layer of burnt sienna. And the reason we're going to do that is our lightest shade. We're going to go in wet because we really want it to have some good disbursement. You can do this wet and dry if you want to, but I really like the effect of the wet and wet for this first layer. So I'm trying to concentrate the pigment a little bit heavier on the right. Not a lot, but just a little, because if you notice on our reference photo, the light is coming from the left. So I'm just very carefully using this 3/4 inch brush to try and coax this pigment around and get it everywhere I want it. And then we'll rinse that brush off and go in and pick up a little bit more pigment, just tapping it in over there on the right-hand side, just to give that area a little bit more strength. You want to have your areas darker everywhere the light is not as strong. Anything that is darker will recede to the back, and since our cone is curved, we definitely want to have that subtle shadow on the right-hand side. I'm just smoothing out the edge there. A little drawing tip when you're drawing this one, I would draw the shape of the cone with a ruler down the center so that you can kind of try and get those edges symmetrical, because if they're not, you'll notice it right away. The bottom of the cone is hanging off of the picture, so that is the way I drew it on our book. You could make this smaller and make the entire thing fit on your page if you wanted to. Now let's do the chocolate, which is our top scoop. I'm still using my 3/4 inch brush. I would like you to try and use your large stroke brush as much as you can. They're really fun once you get used to them. They're very versatile. You can get into some pretty tight spaces. When you feel like you're using the little corner an awful lot, that's a good time to switch to a round. But I really like using these 3/4 inch flat stroke brushes for many things other than just backgrounds, because I like their versatility. You just need to get used to curving it around, and here's where I decided that it is time indeed to switch to the number 6. So the color I'm using is our burnt umber. That's the one right next to the burnt sienna that's a little bit darker brown. And I'm just going to mix a little pool of that, a little bit darker strength, and I'm going to try and drop in now, because now I can do wet and wet. So I'm dropping in a little bit of the shadows and shapes. If you look at the reference photo, you'll see that that ice cream has quite a bit of texture. The chocolate has a lot more texture than the strawberry, but we're going to go ahead and take advantage of how that wet pigment that I've already got down there, how that's dispersing. And that, in combination with looking at our reference photo again and again, your eyes should be going to your reference photo, back to your painting, to your reference photo, to your painting. And you can follow the shadows along where the pigment has naturally fallen, in addition to creating more shadows and defining them a little bit more by looking at your reference photo and just kind of trying to get a little bit of the first layer of shading in there to make it look not completely smooth. And the way that that's done is just by tapping pigment in different locations. So you see where that area of pigment I put in is so dark, that definitely looks like it's kind of a divot or a dent or some kind of shading in our ice cream there. So we'll just continue to tap around here And that light is coming in from the left, so we do want to keep that area on the right just a little bit darker. Now let's look at our cone here a little bit. Do you see how that is pooling down at the bottom? We want to pick that up because whenever you see that pooling happen, that will definitely cause a back run. And once again, if you are unfamiliar with that term, a back run is when you have a wet area and then the water congregates down at the end. The main area will dry, and then that water has nowhere to go, so it goes back up into the dry area. And then you end up looking like it has a watermark on it. It's an effect that you can use to your advantage, but for what we're doing here today, we don't want any back runs. So we're taking our time to make sure that this is completely dry, and I'm using the Ranger Heated Craft Tool. I do have this listed in the description, and I think that it's something, if you're looking to invest in something like this, it's really a good idea because if you're using a blow dryer, sometimes the air that comes out of it is just too powerful, and then you can actually move your paint. So we don't want to do that. Let's go in now and let's get some of our alizarin crimson. That's this red here, our cool red. We've used the burnt sienna and the burnt umber, and now we're using the alizarin crimson. So not too many. We'll end up with 4 pigments in all in this creation here. This red is really pretty vibrant, and you can thin it down, but I was kind of thinking that I love this pink so much. That's one thing I really love about this Cotman set is the shade of their alizarin crimson. So I really wanted to go all in and have it be nice and vibrant. This ice cream could be cherry if you want. That's okay. And actually, you could change the flavor. You could use green, make it mint, whatever your favorite flavors of ice cream are. If you wanted to do a vanilla, I would do a burnt sienna and water it down a lot so that it's barely tan. And then you could go in and add little speckles from the burnt umber for the vanilla beans. So there's so many things you could do. If you wanted to add chocolate chips to either one of these, I would use the burnt umber, and you'll see how we darken that a little bit coming up here with just a touch of ultramarine. So we're just adding some of the shades and texture into the cherry or strawberry cone here, and I'm making sure to create a shadow up under that chocolate, because what will happen is when the ice cream is sitting on top of the other cone, a shadow will be cast. There will also be a shadow at the bottom just under the cherry ice cream over the cone area, so we want to be sure and get that one in too. So remembering to concentrate more pigment over on the right hand side, let's just continue to shape this cone. It is, like I said, a lot smoother, so you'll have to continue to look at your reference photo as always, making sure that you get all of the texture in there that you want. So I'm just getting that top area a little bit darker, going all around it here with another layer of pigment, just to make sure I have it the exact shade that I want. Now you want to remember when you're painting that your watercolor will dry a couple shades lighter. So it might be kind of shockingly dark to you at first, but just remember it will dry a little bit lighter. There is a color shift. Every time you use watercolor, you're going to have it dry just a little bit lighter. Now this technique that I'm doing right now is called lifting off. You'll notice I dip my brush in the water, tap it off on the paper towel, and then I have a thirsty brush. That's what that's called. And I can go in and fairly firmly wipe up some of that color. I wanted to lift out some of the pigment so that I could definitely establish that that left side of the cone was in the light and a little bit lighter. So we'll just continue along working on the sculpting and shading of this ice cream cone. And now it's time to dry it once again. I really like using this heated craft tool. It's quiet. Blow dryer is a whole lot more noisy. And as you can see, you can kind of hold it in one position for a while and not risk burning your paper. You do want to keep it moving, but I do have another heat tool that I got that was kind of a from a hardware store. Excuse me, I couldn't think of the word. And you know, it's really meant for like melting plastic, that kind of thing. And I really like it, but boy, it's a lot to use on watercolor. I tend to save it for other crafts. So just keep that in mind, that the temperature that you have from your heat tool, you don't want it to be too hot. So now we're going to grab some of that burnt umber, and this time I'm going to add the darkest shadows in our chocolate cone. So I'm adding a touch of ultramarine. That is a great thing to remember whenever you're mixing a brown, either your burnt sienna or your burnt umber with an ultramarine. You can darken those colors up and eventually bring them to a black. So you can create shades of gray, all kinds of neat things. I really encourage you to play with your palette of paints. Make a grid, mix the colors, see what you can come up with. It's just a whole world of color there, even though you only have 12 in your palette. Actually, if you just want to get started and want to buy a very few paints, I would recommend getting a red, yellow, and blue. And Daniel Smith actually has a really good set. If you're looking to start with some professional paints, I would look for their mixing set. It's a beautiful set of paints, tubes. You can leave it in the tubes, or you can buy a little palette to put them in. But at any rate, red, yellow, and blue literally will give you all of the colors that you need. And then if you wanted to extend that palette, you could get a set of cool red, yellow, blue, and a set of warm red, yellow, blue. Okay, back to our ice cream here. You can see that we've added the darkest shadows and shapes, and we're just kind of continuing to sculpt that texture. Don't forget to leave those highlights and lighter spots, because that's what really gives your ice cream an awful lot of body and form to it. Now let's do the same thing with our cherry cone. Now we want to start away from that area where we worked on with the chocolate, because we don't want any wet watercolor to touch watercolor that's already wet, because what's going to happen then is they will merge together. Again, that is a technique that you can use strategically to your advantage in certain pieces, but for right now we want to keep these two ice cream colors separate. So we're starting to work on the bottom here, and we're using that alizarin crimson. But eventually I will add a touch of ultramarine to that as well, just to deepen those shadows a little bit. And again, we're going to keep the ice cream darker on the right-hand side. So you can see here, I'm trying to get all of these clefts and divots that we're seeing in the ice cream cone, and just kind of accentuating them a little, just kind of giving them a little artistic twist. You know, you can change this up however you want. You can make your cone as textured or as smooth as you like. You can make it soft serve if you want to get all those shadows in there from like a twist cone or some other kind of soft serve ice cream dispenser. You know, you can have a lot of fun with this. And with that cherry or strawberry flavor, you could put some pieces of fruit in there. There's so many things you can do with this. I just wanted to keep it simple for us today so that we can have a nice accomplishment of some really cute ice cream that looks pretty tasty. And I think when you're done, especially with the cone, I think you'll see that this is really pretty good looking. And it's amazing how simple it is to create something just using the basic techniques of watercolor, letting the watercolor do the work for you. I'm such a huge proponent of that. And by using wet and wet, or dropping in wet into damp, you can really create some wonderful textures and shadows and just subtle gradients of color. That's one of the things about watercolor that I really, really love. Now we're focusing on these darkest shadows here. I definitely have that ultramarine mixed in. I'm sorry if it's out of frame and it can't quite be seen right now, but we put in those darkest shadows up under the chocolate and along the bottom, and focused a little bit of them on the right side too. So once again, we'll get this completely dry. The other thing I like about this heated tool is it's very lightweight, so you won't tire out your hand. Now it's time to focus on that cone. We just have our base layer on, and you can see we can, I hope you can see anyway, we can still see our waffle lines on the cone. Now this is where you might want to continually refer once again back to the reference photo, because as we add layers onto this, as we add glazes on, we are going to be able to see those lines a little bit less. But we've gone back to our 3/4 inch flat stroke brush, and I'm focusing the pigment on the right hand side here, mixing it in with a little of that dark burnt umber and ultramarine mix that we have, just kind of tapping in some of the darker areas, and just keeping that right side of the cone a little bit darker than the left. So you can see with manipulating this brush and using this pigment in varying strengths and mixes, we can create a lot of dimension on this cone, and we haven't even put in the waffle texture yet. So I'm tapping in a little bit more shading just up under the ice cream, and trying to get that fold going down at an angle where when the cone is rolled around, and then that's the end of the waffle there that's sealed. So that's something else for you to notice in the reference photo. The part where the waffle comes around and meets the other edge of the cone, if you can look, the squares are at a different angle. So the right side of the cone there, we're going to make those squares almost straight up and down. And then the ones on the left will be tipped to the left quite a bit. that will help us establish that the cone is indeed a conical shape. So there's a lot of tricks and detail that you can notice that will help you get a little bit more realism in your watercolor. Now let's move on to a number 4 round. That's the third brush in our set. And we'll mix up some burnt umber, get a little more water going there. We're just going to mix some burnt umber here with a little bit of that ultramarine blue. We want this to be really dark, like a chocolatey brown, almost a dark chocolate. And now if we look at the squares on the waffle, notice where those shadows are. They are kind of on the top and the left. So this is the way that I decided to do this, is to just make little bracket shapes to delineate where those squares are shaded. So this is kind of a little bit of negative painting here. We're not going in and painting each square, we're just painting the shadows that are cast from the ridges. So right now it's going to look a little silly, it's going to look a little weird, but just have faith in the process. Every time you work on watercolor, it will go through an ugly phase. I promise you, don't get discouraged. Don't feel like you don't know what you're doing. You're doing just fine. It's just that watercolor all goes through a really weird phase sometime. And this is the weird time for this ice cream cone. We're just going to continue putting in these little bracket shapes here. And you'll see on one of them, I kind of get the bracket on the wrong side, but it doesn't really matter. I think over here is where it got lost in the pattern, and then I ended up putting one of the brackets on the right-hand side. But it'll all work out in the end. It all comes out in the wash, as they say. Haha, quite literally. We're going to put a wash over this. Now, while this is still damp, we're still putting in some of these brackets here. But while this is still damp, we're going to go in with just a wet brush and just wipe over the entire surface. Now, what you want to do is to make sure that your brush doesn't have too much water on it. So dip it in your water and then tap it off on your paper towel. I always like to have a paper towel handy right under my water jar, as well as one on the left side of my work so I can grab it if I need it. Basically what we're doing here is just kind of smearing those brackets that we just drew. And now we're going to go in and draw just a little bit more detail on them. While it's still wet, we will fill in those shadows just a little bit more. So can you see how up near the top there, it's really coming out to just look like actual waffle dents, waffle divots. I hope you can, and I hope that you'll find that you're quite happy with this piece when you're done, because I think that this is a really good way to do a waffle cone. And then when you're done with this, I didn't go in with any colored pencil at the end, but you sure could. You could extend those shadows and make them even more defined if you wanted to go in with some colored pencil afterwards. So always keep that in mind. It's always an option to go in with some colored pencil or a pastel pencil, some other kind of media if you wanted to add to your watercolor. You absolutely can do that. The only time I've seen a restriction against that is if you're entering your watercolor in some kind of a show and they request that it is purely watercolor. Some shows will allow watercolor pencil to be used in those cases. So, just if you are entering something in a show, just make sure you're very, very clear on what their rules are, what their requirements are for those entries. So here we are, we're working on that right-hand side again, and I wanted to go ahead and put in another layer of shading, to get that shadow established so that we can make sure that we're keeping that cone curved. Now this time you'll see the curve there I put on the shadow. If you look very closely at the ice cream cone, and it's very difficult to see, but the shading that is on the right-hand side does follow kind of that curve, and that will help you understand when you're looking at this that the round cones are on top of a conical shape. Sometimes what you can do, if it's hard for you to see these things in your reference photo, you can turn it to black and white, you can turn the chroma up or down, or you can kind of build a model in your own studio with a tennis ball and a cone of paper and see how the light falls on that, see how the shadow falls. A lot of those kinds of exercises will really help you on your artistic journey to help you understand how light and shadow work, because really that's all watercolor is filling in series of light and shadow, which will give us a realistic effect. I have to apologize if you can hear something in the background. I think my neighbor has turned on a snowblower or something. So I'm sorry if you can hear that. And I'm also down here in my basement studio, and occasionally the heater does come on. So I always apologize for some background noises. I've got a new microphone too coming, and I'm excited to use that. I'm hoping that this audio is okay. If for any reason it isn't, the workaround that I have to suggest for you is to turn on the subtitles. And I'm sorry that that's where we're at, is a workaround. But I do check my videos several times on different devices before I publish them on YouTube. And then I've had some comments that people are having a hard time with the audio. The audio is always fine when I post it, so I think something might get corrupted in the upload. So if that's happening for you, I'm so sorry. I will get that new microphone, and hopefully that'll eliminate any other variables. I don't know. Technology sometimes escapes me, but we're doing okay. We're hobbling along here. Now we're going in with more of that burnt umber and ultramarine mix, and just doing the same thing. We've gotten that area all marked with the little brackets, went over it with water, and now we're going in and further defining these lines on the cone, the shadows, so that we can accentuate those divots in the waffle. So you see, you're not really making squares. You're just suggesting where those shadows should be. Adding a little bit more of the shadow and putting another wash of burnt sienna on that left side. So I think we're getting pretty close to being finished here. Let's give this another dry. And then I think what this cone needs, you see there up by the chocolate scoop there, just to the left, I did splatter just a touch of burnt sienna. Rather than trying to lift that out, I have an idea. And this is something you can do with your paintings if it calls for it. And I think this one does, because ice cream is very celebratory. It's a lot of fun, and I associate it with birthday parties, summer days, celebrations, all those kinds of holidays that we have. There's always ice cream involved. So what I'd like to do is to do some splatter. Let's get our number 6 round. And in order to splatter, you want to get a big, juicy pile of pigment. Big juicy puddle. So let me clean that off, because that's got a little bit of the ultramarine in it, and that's a little bit too dark. I just want to go in with the straight alizarin crimson. So here I go. I'm mixing up a nice juicy pile, getting it really, really wet here, adding water to that. And now I'm just tapping my brush. This is something, splatter is such a fun addition to water. It's a watercolor, It's a great way to end your painting with flourish. And you might want to spend some time practicing your splatter technique, because it is different. You need to figure out which brush is the best brush to use for splatter, how wet to have your paint, and how far to hold your brush over the surface. There's lots of ways you can do it. I'm just tapping my finger on the surface of the brush as I'm letting it kind of fall down. You can also kind of do little dart throws or javelin throw motions with your brush and let the moisture let the paint come off of the tip of the brush. Lots of different ways you can do it. I did go with our darker mix of the burnt umber, because I wanted those chocolate sprinkles in the air to really stand out. At first I covered the cone, and then I let it get a little bit of splatter on it there. If you wanted to mask off any parts, you could lay down a paper towel, but I decided to kind of just go with it. So here we are at the final drying stage of our ice cream cone, and I think it is turning out so delicious looking. This is a real fun one to have in your arsenal, because you can definitely frame this, hang it up, turn it into a greeting card, make it a gift. Everybody loves ice cream. This is just the funnest, most joyful painting to make, and I'm so glad you could join me today. Here we are. Here's our ice cream cone. I hope you guys had as much fun painting it as I did, and I hope you're really enjoying these watercolor lessons. Thanks for joining me today. If you care to leave a comment, share this video, or bring your friends in with you to watch, that would be really great, and it will help me continue to create content like this. Thanks again. See you soon, and have a great week. Bye now.